Hi, everyone. My name is Anesha, and I'm your host for the Wellness Plus podcast. In today's episode, I would love to introduce you to the show, Sean Blackwell. He's the author of the book, Am I Bipolar or Waking Up? A memoir about his spiritual emergency journey and how it led him to help others with bipolar disorder. Hi, Sean. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Okay, thanks for having me, Anesha. Appreciate it.
So, can you start by walking us through for our viewers, what is a spiritual awakening or a spiritual emergency? What is the difference?
So, spiritual awakening is something that usually for the most part people would think of as maybe a peak experience, and the symptoms or characteristics of a spiritual awakening might be things you might read about in sacred literature, particularly from like Eastern spirituality. So one of the things would be like a sense of connectedness or oneness. You lose a sense of sort of yourself as an individual and you kind of emerge with everything around you. But it could be feelings of like expansive feelings of love coming from the heart, or deep insight into life in some capacity. So any of these things could be classified as an awakening. For many people, they might be atheists or agnostic, and then all of a sudden they have a realization that, oh my God, God exists, and it comes at an experiential level. You know, these are all types of awakenings, and there's a wide variety, but usually they involve, you know, some deep experiential aspect and a deepening of your value system as well, so that they can end up sort of changing your life in a sense. You know, the sort of the story of the banker who gives up his job and then goes off to the mountains, you know, that kind of thing. So that could be a spiritual awakening. All right. And this all sounds nice and makes for good movie content. I think Eckhart Tolle was a guy who, you know, talked about, he had sort of this awakening experience, and then he was sitting on park benches for 2 years, in the park, just sort of taking in reality. And it all sounds very, really kind of, well, lucky him, this kind of thing. But it can also go in what I would call spiritual emergency, which is a term coined by Dr. Stanislav Grof. And the spiritual emergency is, yeah, you've got all that stuff happening too, which is amazing, but it gets to be a bit too much. The sensory overload leads you to think that you're probably dreaming, or maybe you've died. And in my case, I thought I died. My spiritual emergency happened at a self-help seminar, the Landmark Forum, and we were doing a meditation on our fears. And then, boom, I felt this big punch at the chest. And after that, my whole sensory experience shifted. Everything got sharper. I had a sense of all-knowingness. Like finally, I knew things that I never thought I knew before. I felt connected to everything. I lost that sort of boundary between me and the external world. And everything kind of felt perfect to the point where I thought I had died in a scuba diving accident a few months earlier. And once you think you're dead, things start to go in a different direction because you lose your functionality, And in my case, I thought I was being tested by God, which is another important characteristic. And I thought, part of being tested meant I needed to take off my clothes, and I was afraid to urinate in public. And in my case, it was on the carpet of a hotel ballroom, like a 5-star hotel ballroom. And then laid down in it, facing my fears, but laying down in it, right? And then when the security came, I refused to put my clothes back on. They called the police, and then they, attached me to a hospital bed or a stretcher and took me to the psychiatric hospital. And I still thought I was going to heaven or nirvana or something like that, okay? And with all of that, yeah, I ended up in the hospital, but it was still very good for me. This is something that happened in 1996, and it ended 7 years of on again, off again depression. And when I got out and finally had some time to integrate the experience, which took about 4 or 5 months, I went back to work. Was working in advertising at the time. And then over the next 3 years, my salary tripled, you know? So I went from a guy who was really struggling at work to like my career just taking off, you know? And people talk to me or talk to my boss more like about how it really felt like I cared about their business, this kind of thing. The first, I can't get into a lot of details, but some of the first projects I worked on ended up winning advertising awards. It was just like boom, boom, boom. Everything started clicking, you know. Except that I didn't want to be in advertising anymore. I had a shift in values as well. And so my whole life changed, you know, and changed for the better. So it was an emergency in that, yeah, it led to a crisis. It was overwhelming and difficult to integrate. But given time, I was able to process it. And what would be considered breakdown turned into breakthrough in my case. And unfortunately, that is a rare story, but that's how it happened for me.
Wow. So how did you know the difference between a spiritual emergency and any kind of other transformative experience that you may have had in the past?
Oh, because you feel like you're in touch with the divine, you know. It's not a religious awakening, and that's kind of important distinction to make. Some people go through a deep process of religious conversion, okay, which involves, for example, something like accepting Jesus into your heart, or maybe becoming a Buddhist, and you make that transition. And that's a kind of movement forward for people. Okay, that's okay. But in this case, you're having a very much more intimate connection with the divine, so that, for example, if you had been if you had been an atheist, or if you had been an agnostic, or if you're confronted by other atheists or agnostics, you would never be able to deny the connection to the divine that you have, and the realization that that's sort of flowing through every inch of your body. So from distinct experience, you know that God exists, okay, and God exists through you. So if somebody has an experience where they know from personal experience that God exists, regardless of your religious orientation or your belief system, then I would call that a spiritual awakening. And if it puts them in the psychiatric hospital and they come out better for it, I'd call that a spiritual emergency.
How did this lead into wanting to help others with bipolar disorder?
Almost from the minute I was in the hospital, you know, one of the thoughts I had when I was on the stretcher and then shackled to the emergency room bed was that it was a shame that I was dying because I had so much more work to do. Like I almost wanted to start helping people from the time I was in the hospital, you know. And so when I found out that I wasn't dead, which happened a few days, well, I was forcibly injected, which was very traumatizing. But when I came back from my hospitalization, I kind of figured that I wasn't going into heaven or some kind of nirvana, and I was coming back to some sort of reality. Okay, I knew that, and from then I wanted to sort of find my place in the world, but it took a few years to figure that out, and I ended up meeting a woman in Peru who was from Brazil. And we got married, and I went and changed my whole life and moved to Sao Paulo, Brazil, to live with her. Okay, and in 2000, so this was everything that happened to me happened in 1996. So this is a long time ago. Okay, and I haven't been in the hospital since. This was a one-time thing, right? But in 2007, my wife had two sisters who entered into, quote, acute psychosis, which is what they would have labeled mine as acute psychosis. And I just went up to help with my wife and said, and once I heard the symptoms, I was like, well, what they're going through, well, starting with the first niece, my wife's niece, I heard the symptoms that, okay, she's having moments of profound love and connection with things, but other moments of fear. And I was like, well, this sounds like it might have been something like what happened to me. But they were diagnosing it as bipolar disorder. And I thought, well, I'm not sure. I don't know what bipolar disorder is. I had no idea, but I went to, work with her. And because we were supporting her in a more empathetic way than would normally happen, she was able to recover very quickly, although she was medicated. Okay. And it was within a few weeks that I learned that we learned that she was going to be medicated for the entire summer, which totally shocked me. And then as I got into the research, I realized she was going to be medicated for her entire life, And I was just floored with this information that people diagnosed with bipolar disorder are being medicated for life. So I just kind of went on this mission to help myself understand what is the difference between this thing, bipolar disorder, and this spiritual emergency that I had, because I was having a hard time determining the difference. And so my first videos on YouTube were on my YouTube channel, which at the time was called Am I Bipolar or Waking Up? And my first video was kind of like, hey guys, am I bipolar or waking up? You tell me. And I told my story. And then all this feedback came back to me from people around the world who were currently medicated for life, but had these extraordinarily powerful spiritual aspects to what they were going through. And all of a sudden, what I thought was like an experience like I had, which I thought would be like something 1 in 20,000 people might have, was looking more like 1 in 20. And I was like, whoa, like this is a big deal. This is a really big deal. Something is seriously wrong here. And I started making videos about what I was learning about pioneering psychologists, for example, who had actually supported people through acute psychosis in First Break. In First Break, people like Dr. Lauren Mosher at Soteria House, Dr. John Weir Perry at the Diabasis Clinic. I started to learn about their work. And then I started to see that this concept I'd adopted of spiritual emergency was actually just a small piece of a bigger puzzle, which was that there were leading edge psychologists in the 1980s who had actually supported people through acute psychosis entirely, and that work actually goes back to Dr. R.D. Laing in the 1960s. So the cat was out of the bag to a certain degree, because what I did was I started to put together the theoretical concepts that had helped me understand what was going on with people with bipolar disorder, or people labeled with bipolar disorder. Okay. And the idea I had was that if I had studied it in a book and it came from a pioneering psychologist like Dr. Stanislav Grof or John Weir Perry or Lauren Mosher, if I'd learned about something in a book, if it had reflected my experience or somebody I'd worked with directly, like my nieces, and people reporting it to me through the comment section in YouTube with all those YouTubers responding to my book or responding to my videos, then I would make a video about it. And I made these very intensive slideshows. And so one of the first video I made was called The Real Cause of Bipolar Disorder, this sort of cocky title to get some attention. And usually acute psychosis, almost always, starts with a series of powerful triggers, okay? Usually related to loss or failure, but sometimes it could be success. So for example, winning the lottery could be a trigger for a manic episode. But it often involves death in the family, changing location, going away to university. These are very common triggers. And the use of mind-altering substances as well, in particular psychedelics and heavy marijuana use can be a significant trigger. So over 80% of the people who have contacted me were using mind-altering substances before their first episode. Okay, so that can be a break. But also very intense meditation. For example, going on a 10-day Vipassana meditation retreat can be a trigger, because all of these different things break down our ego functioning. And it's when that ego breaks down, either through the sort of good spiritual means of being an intensive meditator or being a drug-addicted college student, if that ego breaks down, then all of a sudden we can lose our functionality. So that's where it starts, okay? And then I just might say then once that ego breaks down, you can have the mystic experiences that we've already talked about. But then later what will come up are roots of trauma that will start to surface. So that's the other force coming through. So when people have had significant trauma in their lives, that can be a big thing that's looking to heal during these experiences, whether you call it acute psychosis or spiritual emergency, all right? And I would say that on the spiritual emergency sort of end of the spectrum, you'll find people who've had fairly blessed lives, not so traumatized. Maybe they're dealing with emotional repression as part of their traumas. And then at the other end of the spectrum where it's more difficult, you'll have like serious physical and sexual abuse happening to people at a young age. And that's a much more challenging task to deal with. But I see both as spiritual at the same time. It's just one is more challenging than the other.
Hey guys, I would like to take a moment to introduce you to our app, Yoga Plus. You will have access to an incredible selection of videos led by top instructors in yoga, fitness, nutrition, and so much more. Download our Yoga Plus app available on iOS and Android today.